Flight of the Wasp is not about an era, it's about the entire sweep of American history, which is something that I've been trying to do throughout my career. You know, my generation was an attempt to do that. Flight of the Wasp was actually the book that I conceived of before I wrote 740 Park. When my publisher said to me, I don't mind being told through a microcosm, find a different microcosm. I had pitched the story of one wasp family over 400 years to her. It was inspired by the mother of a friend of mine who came from two or three of the great colonial wasp families, who had written a revenge memoir about her own family. Um, and asked me what I thought she should do with it. And my advice was, you should burn it. And it was never published and has never seen the light of day. But the title of her book was The Sting of the Wasp. And both the title and the concept of a wasp family stuck with me over the years. And years later, so I pitched it. I wrote 740 Park again. Instead, I went off on different tangents. And in about 2016, 2017, I came back to that idea in a conversation with an editor who asked me about books that I'd never written. And I told him about The Sting of the Wasp, as it was called at that point. And being a fifth or sixth generation wasp himself, he said, I'm going to publish that book. And then I had to figure out what to do. And I had thought, as I said, of doing one family, and he felt that that was far too limiting, and forced me into creating a book that was 1,000 times more difficult to report and write, because he wanted. There's a joke hidden in this somewhere. He wanted diversity in a book about white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. He didn't just want a New York family. He wanted families from here, there, and everywhere. He didn't want one family. He wanted a number of families. He wanted families that were liberal as well as families that were conservative, families that were abolitionist as well as families that had held slaves. He was absolutely right. Little did I know that that was going to set me off on a 5-year journey into the world of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant gentry. So the book came about out of that urge to tell history through a microcosm. And Flight of the Wasp became something very different from what I'd conceived initially. Flight of the Wasp became a look at American history through the group that created American history and was then sidelined by American history, which is a fascinating story. I thought one that still resonates today. The criteria was that they had to be a colonial American family, period. The secondary criteria was that in each era of American history, I wanted to focus on a single individual, or at most two individuals in any given span of years, any given generation. So in each family had to have someone who was a big enough character that they could be symbolic of an era of American history. So, for instance, the Bradfords was William Bradford, who was the head of the Plymouth Colony. Also, if they then connected to other Wasp families, which they all did, because it was a very small world, and they were all marrying each other, sleeping with each other, having affairs with each other, going to parties with each other. If there was continuity that could go through the years, even better. Mostly I looked for families where there were still living representatives walking the earth. But the primary thing was to find billboard-sized families that had produced an individual who I could focus on in an era. And then the structural idea of the book was you lead into that individual by telling the story of the family until you get to that individual, and then you lead out of that individual by telling the rest of the family story. Obviously, the Biddles, for instance. One of the leading Biddles today told me that he thought that as far as he knew, there were 8,000 living Biddles in America. Obviously, I couldn't do all of them. In that case, you know, there was it was a blend of access and enterprise journalism, because Flight of the Wasp demanded that I get interviews with living people, but also that I write about families that wouldn't speak to me. In one or two cases, families that don't exist anymore. So there was no one to speak. Um, so I found a couple people who I knew instantly I wanted to write about. There was a gentleman named Governor Morris, who was the least known and most interesting founding father. Um, and his family spread and had great influence. He married a cousin of a gentleman from the South named Jack Randolph, who was the Tea Party before there was a Tea Party. He was a ranting, right-wing, um, hypocritical psycho who claimed to be a great friend of Black people, but also was a slaveholder. And, just a fascinating character. He was also a drug addict. He was also non-binary, which was kind of interesting from the context of today. So in it was a narrowing process. It was just find the people. And what ended up happening was I would stumble across interconnections between these families. My favorite story about this was one of the early interviews I did was with a descendant of William Bradford of the Mayflower and the Plymouth Colony, who I had known growing up, named Whitney Tower Jr. And I went to see Whitney in West Palm Beach, Florida, where he lives. And he asked me who else was in the book. And I'm going through all of the characters, and I get to one of the last characters in the book, who was the producer of Hair, a gentleman named Michael Butler, who came from a very, very prominent family from Illinois. And Whitney starts to crack up, and I said, "What?" And he told me that his father had almost married Michael Butler's sister and had an affair with her. And, it was just these kind of serendipitous connections would appear. There was a Biddle who was married to a relative of a Sanford. Henry Sanford is the character who represents the Civil War and the immediate post-Civil War period. A kind of reprobate wasp who couldn't succeed, couldn't take a step without falling over his own shoelaces. And a member of his family had married a Biddle. These odd interconnections were, it was like discovering Easter eggs as I went along the path of writing the book.